Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 2nd of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the north of LPR region, or the east of Kharkiv region, from Kupyansk front line. Kupyansk-Liman front line. The Ukrainians activated in this area and started attacking the Russians all along the front line. They were trying to penetrate the Russian defense orders. To tell the truth, the Western sources map or the Ukrainian sources haven't provided any information about the progress. But if we're talking about the Russians, they're saying that as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 400 soldiers all along the front line, starting from Kupyansk. They were trying to attack Yagodne, Nikhailovka, Orlyanskaya, Kislovka, and from the south they were trying to develop their offensive operation in direction of the road that connects Kremenaya and Svatova, but the Ukrainians lost around 400 soldiers and something around 32 vehicles, including tanks, armored vehicles, or let's say trucks or vehicles and something like this. So as you can see, the Ukrainians couldn't achieve any success in this area, but they continue trying to penetrate the Russian defense order. Furthermore, we are seeing more and more updates from the Ukrainian side that they're preparing the defense line from Zolochev, from this area towards Vovchansk. All the border between Russian Federation and Ukraine now is turning into a very powerful fortification, with many lines of fortification, of trenches and so on. So the Ukrainians still have, there is still chances that the Russians might use this area as an area to attack the Ukrainians. So that's why the Ukrainians want to be just on the safe side, and they're building a lot of fortifications between the Kharkiv and Belgorod, between these two towns. If we are talking about any movements of the forces in this area, the only update we can say, if we take a look at the map of this position, we're going to see that there is a small update with 92nd Mechanized Brigade. The Ukrainians moved their main forces of this brigade on this bank of Oskol River. But for now there are no more changes, no more forces were moved here. So I believe that Ukrainians, even if we take a look at this disposition of this map, we see that there are not much forces, at least on the north area, on the north side of this area, but there are a lot of forces on the same Kramatorsk-Lymansk Bakhmut bridgehead. Now let's talk about this bridgehead. Today there were no updates from both sides. There are no movements, and it doesn't mean that there are no clashes. There are very clashes along the front lines, but these days, as soon as the Ukrainians completed their counter-offensive operation in the north, now they were able to move and to return back their forces on this bridgehead, because they understand the value of town by the name of Bakhmut. And if we take a look at the map of this position, you're going to see that Ukrainians moved a lot of forces exactly on this bridgehead, on Bakhmut. Furthermore, they try to keep their forces as close as possible to Avdiivka bridgehead. Let's take a look at Bakhmut forces one more time, and if you see, during the previous weeks we saw just few brigades like 62nd Mechanized Brigade in this area. This one that was the latest, the freshest update in this area, but from the 24th of October till these days, the Ukraine moved more reserves. They moved their battalion Dudaev, it's Chechen's Foreign Legions, Chechen's National Battalion. Furthermore, the Ukrainians moved their 53rd Mechanized Brigade. It's a very fresh update. Also, the Ukrainians moved their special forces we discussed. They moved their 109th Territory Brigade. It's also very fresh update, just a few days ago the Ukrainians moved. Also, the Ukrainian moves their 30th Mechanized Brigade in this area, 2nd Battalion of these forces. So, if you remember, Zelensky told that situation in Bakhmut was very difficult, and most of the forces, Ukrainians, most of these forces, Ukrainians were using on the north and any other front line, trying to penetrate the Russian defense order, and those offensive operations made possible for the Russians to develop their offensive operation in direction of Bakhmut, and they, as you remember, they took a lot of towns during the north counter-offensive operation. The Russians got control over Nikolaevka другая, Отрадовка, Зайцево, Веселая Долина, Ivangorod, this town, small town that located on the east from Opytne. And now we see that the Ukrainians used a lot of reserves and they moved their forces to stop the Russian development in Bakhmut. And this is very important because, as you can see, the Ukrainians were forced to use their reserves. Now let's move a little bit to the south. And now we're going to move to our Avdiivka area. As you can see, Donetsk is under very heavy fire. Today we got more reports about the losses among civilians. And if you remember, yesterday we started discussion that the Russians activated on the Verkhnitoretsk, Novomikhailivsk front line. And there were some movements in direction of more Bakhmutovka. The Russians made few attempts to clear the situation, to make some recon combat. And if we take a look at the map of this position, we see that there are also some updates in this area. This the area I'm talking about. The Ukrainians moved their 110th mechanized brigade in this area, and now this brigade is responsible for defending of the north of Avdiivka bridgehead. For now, the Russians couldn't achieve any success, so maybe that was the recon combats as we discussed. But for now, the Russians are pushing, as you can see, along the front line, along the bridgehead, but for now without any success. And now we are moving to our Vuhledar front line, to this area. As you can see, there are not much icons in this area. The Russians reported that their offensive operations slowed down, that they even stopped at some points. The Ukrainians managed to move the reserves in this area. For now, if we take a look at the map of this position, there are no new icons in this area, but I believe soon we're going to see the update of this map and we're going to see more brigades in this area. And this is also very important signal, because as we discussed, the Ukrainians moved a lot of forces in direction of Bakhmut, a lot of reserves, and then they were forced to move some reserves in direction of Vuhledar to this area. If we're talking about the Russians, they have activated another small tactical front line in direction of Prichistovka, that located on the west from Pavlovka. If we're talking about the Pavlovka, the same situation. The Russians are trying to clear the north part of this town, but the Ukrainians have possibility to pin the Russians down from Vuhledar and to move small groups of reserves to the south, trying to stop the Russians. If we're talking about Vodyane, the Russians are moving in this direction, but there were no updates about the progress. I believe that they reached some checkpoints or fortifications, and now they're trying to reduce them, because it's a vital question for the Russians to cut the road between Vuhledar and Konstantinovka, this one, because as soon as they're able to do this, we can say that we can start counting days before Vuhledar is going to fall. But for now, the Russians have established just the fire control over the road without any progress, without any physical crossing of this road. If we're talking about Novomikhailivka, today the Russians reported that they got as close as possible to this town. There were a few updates that the Russians even managed to enter the south outskirts, the south suburbs of this town, but without any progress. The only thing that the Russians reported that now they're trying to prepare trenches and fortifications right in front of Novomikhailivka. So, to tell the truth, a very difficult situation, very difficult to understand, because as we can see, at least by the 10th of November, we see that the Russians managed to take maybe a few kilometers from the previous front line. They managed to enter the south part of Pavlovka. They managed to move a little bit from Shevchenkovka to the north in direction of Prichistovka. Now they're building some kind of maybe the checkpoints in front of these towns that they are able to use to attack these towns with using some kind of anti-tank missiles, artillery, mortar missiles, and so on. The same situation in Mikhailivka. The only progress they managed to achieve is that they got as close as possible to this town, and now they're building trenches. I can't say that this is the real offensive operation in this area that brought them significant success. Yes, they developed their position situations from a tactical perspective. Yes, if you're talking about Ukrainians, it became harder to defend their area. I believe that their losses might increase because of the fact that now the Russians are able to attack these towns from many sides, but not just from one side or two sides. But anyway, the Ukrainians are still there, and the only we can say that the only success, the only progress, important progress that the Russians managed to achieve in this area is that the Russians forced the Ukrainians to move some reserve to this area. So now we can say that Ukrainians were forced to move the reserves to Bakhmut, and this is Vuhledar is the second area where the Ukrainians were forced to move their reserves. We saw the same picture, but from the Ukrainian side during the late August and September's counteroffensive from their side, because if you remember when the Ukrainians made at least four attempts of attacks, and just the final one was successful. And I'm talking about the counteroffensive operation in Kherson district, and that forced the Russians to move the reserves in this area. Then their attack in direction of Energodar, when they're trying to make some marine operation crossing with the river, and the Russians were forced to move more reserves in this area. Then there was some fake attacks on this air front line that forced the Russians to move another group of their reserves, and that situation brought to another situation when the Russians were totally empty on the Kharkiv front line, and that allowed the Ukrainians to cross this area, and they stopped us when the fuel in the engine finished and something like this. And now we see the situation, what we can see. So for now, we can say that the Russians, at least my understanding of the situation, that the Russians are trying to do the same things that the Ukrainians did during those offensive operations. First, they forced the Ukrainians to move reserves to Bakhmut. Now they're forcing the Ukrainians to move the reserves in direction of Vuhledar. And the question is, where is the next area the Russians are planning to attack? Because if we're talking about just the suburbs of Pavlovka, the trenches on the south of Novomikhailivka, trenches on the south of Prichistovka, and I don't know, positions around Bakhmut, and I'm not sure that all this offensive operation worse the losses that the Russians had during those offensive operations. Yes, they managed to improve their tactical positions, but if you are doing something like this, that means that at the end of all these offensive operations, at the end of all these manipulations with the reserves by the Ukrainian side, we should see something very big that should penetrate the Ukrainian orders without any problems, because of the fact that Ukrainians by that time should be out of reserves. So that's why I believe that we need to expect at least another places where the Russians will try to develop their offensive operation. And as we understand, it's better to attack at the places where the weakest position of your enemy. So I believe that soon we're going to see something like this. If we're talking about the Orekhov front line, there are no changes, there are no icons, as you can see. The only update, we can see that according to the map of disposition, the Ukrainians moved the 65th Mechanized Brigade in this area. But anyway, even if Ukrainians moved the 65th Mechanized Brigade, it doesn't mean that the Ukrainians do have enough of manpower in this area to do some kind of penetration operation in this area, because we see that there are no real force that Ukrainians are able to use to start offensive operation in this area, according to map of disposition. Because there are not much forces here. There are forces that Ukrainians are able to use to hold this position, but I'm not sure that they are able to attack. This is the area, Bakhmut, Kramatorsk, this is the area where the Ukrainians do have possibilities to attack, because they have, we can say, endless resources of their forces, and they're very well protected, very well defended. The logistics here is stable, so it's the most powerful place where the Ukrainians had the significant number of their forces. Now we are moving to Kryvyi Rog area. There are also some changes, and there are also some updates. As you can see, the Ukrainians are attacking this area using the HIMARS heavily, very heavily. They're attacking the bank of the river, Dnipro River, the both sides of this river, trying to reduce. They know there are not much places where the Russians are able to cross this river, and all these places are under 24 hours control, not just by the drones that Ukraine using are here. Also, we know that the United States of America almost on the everyday basis are sending the Black Hawk drones in this area on the south of Black Sea, and I believe that from this area they are able to control everything, the south of Ukraine, easily. So I believe that Ukrainians do have possibility to follow the situation along this river 24 hours in online mode, so it's not a very big deal to attack anything, any crossing, any attempt from this area. And as you can see, we see what we see. There are at least 4 updates of the fact that Ukrainians were trying, that the Russians, or maybe more, updates that the Russians meant to shut down few drones in this area, which that Ukrainians were using to follow the situation. Furthermore, if we take a look at this map, we see that Ukrainians were attacking Novokahomka using Hammers. The Ukrainians were attacking the Antonovka bridge, the pontoon bridge near Antonovka bridge. Also, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russian position on the suburbs of Kherson. I believe that there is a trenches in this area and so on. Furthermore, the Ukrainians made another attempt of attack in direction of the same towns, Bruskinskaya, Petykhatka, but they were stopped by the Russians, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainian lost around something around 105 soldiers and something around 18 armored vehicles. There were no more updates about the Ukrainian progress in direction of Mylova, and there were no more updates about this bridgehead. The Russians, I believe, are still there. They're not planning to give up or to retreat. I believe that they feel themselves very comfortable, at least for now. If we're talking about the deployment map, there are some changes in this area. The Ukrainians moved their 24th Mechanized Brigade in this area, as you can see, very fresh update. And also the Ukrainians moved the 60th Infantry Brigade, as you can see. So if we're talking about, let's say, the 20th of October, the Ukrainians moved a lot of force in this area. As you can see, 128, then they moved their 17th Tank Brigade, they moved the 60th Infantry Brigade, they moved their 17th Tank Brigade, Tank Battalion. So they moved a lot of fresh forces. And as you can see, there are also a very big number of Ukrainian forces in Kherson district, and this, so we can say that there are 2 places where the Ukrainians have a lot of forces. It's like, one more time, the Liman, Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, this area, Seversk, Bakhmut, there are a lot of forces, and we can say that there are almost the same number of the Ukrainian forces in Kherson district. But also, if you see, there are also a lot of forces from the Russian side as well. So situation is difficult for both sides. And I must say, I see, according to my understanding of this situation, both of the parties, Ukrainians and the Russians, are afraid of doing, of attacking, of being the first party who is going to attack. Both of them are afraid because they understand that, let's say, if the Russians started like, let's say, significant, very powerful offensive operation from Kherson direction of Nikolaev, of course they will be reduced to ruins. They would completely destroyed and collapsed because of a very big number of Ukrainian forces in this area, and this will allow the Ukrainians to start their own offensive operation as soon as the Russians will be defeated. And of course, the Ukrainians will be able to take Kherson easily. The same situation is here. The Russians are not able to start a big counteroffensive operation in direction of Seversk, or they are not able to return control over Liman for now, because they know that there are a lot of Ukrainians who is there and who is just waiting when the Russians are going to start doing something like this. And of course, if the Russians starts, they will have a lot of losses, and this will allow the Ukrainians to achieve at least two things they need. First of all, they will be able to capture a lot of Russian weapon, tanks, artillery. This is the things they like to do. And of course, they will be able to start their own counteroffensive operation. The same situation from the Ukrainian side. Yes, we see that they're trying to do something, to develop something, but I believe that mainly the Ukrainians are doing this offensive operation from Kherson side and from Bakhmut side, just with one reason: to spot the Russian artillery positions. Because as soon as the Ukrainians started any movements, all their movements are spotted by the Russian drones, spies, and something by satellites. And after that, in minutes, the Russians start attacking this area using artillery that are spotted few moments later by the Ukrainian drones, Ukrainian satellites, and after that the Ukrainians started their artillery attack on the Russian position using HIMARS and so on. So this is the game. Mainly all the Ukrainian attacks is a part of artillery duels game. The best solution all the time, of course, you can hunt for one artillery system per day, but it's better when you have a very big army. Of course, it's better to try to spot as much as possible artillery systems of your enemy, of their warehouses, of their depots, of their places where they're hiding the artillery system. For these cases, you need to simulate the attacks, and the Ukrainians are simulating attacks, trying to spot everything they can, and after that they're attacking, the Russian attacking back. But nobody do great attacks. And I believe that maybe nobody is going to do anything. The only thing that the Russians are able to do in this situation is to storm the towns like Bakhmut, like Avdiivka, like Peski, Marinka, the places where they have some position, slowly, step by step, trying to penetrate these trenches. But these operations might take, even we can say, let's take a look at Marinka. It's a small village, and of course the Russians are able to penetrate this area to take, but it will take months, because there are heavy clashes for every single street, every single house on the street, because both sides have possibilities to move reserves. So for now, this is the only thing that the Russians are able to do, to push on the positions they have, just to push slowly, meter by meter. I'm not saying that this is a very nice decision, and of course these solutions are not going to bring any success, or it will bring, but not very soon. And this is the reason. More and more more and more interesting updates are coming from Belarus, because a lot of Western sources and Russian sources reports that more and more Russian sources were deployed and still deploys in Belarus. Like a lot of convoys using the railroads, stations, tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft. A lot of forces are moving in this direction from the Russian side. And from my perspective, I understand that the only one way that the Russians are able to break the situation, of course, or to use the nuclear weapon, because maybe just to pin down the Ukrainians completely, or to open the second front line in Ukraine. And as you can see, there are a lot of places where the Russians are able to do this. They can do this on the north, from, let's say, Kovel to the Dnieper. From this area, of course, the Russians are able to attack Chernigov, Sumy, this area. They just need to make a decision and to open the second front line. And this, of course, in this case, the Ukrainians will be forced to move a lot of forces to the north, or to the Belarus, or to Chernigov. And of course, this situation will make the Russian forces in this area situation much easier. And of course, with help of opening of the second front line, they will be able to start their own development in this area and finally penetrate the Ukrainians' defense orders. If we're talking about the north, there are, as we discussed, two ways how to do this: or to attack the west part of Ukraine. This might bring them success, and this might bring them possibilities to cut the supply road between Poland and the western countries in Ukraine. But from the other side, it may activate some forces in the western countries in the NATO. And the second one is to open the front line near Chernigov and Sumy in this area. This area is mainly media victory, and the only thing that the Russians are able to achieve is to block Kiev from east and just to force Zelensky to start negotiation process. I believe that nobody are able to develop anything and it's time to start negotiation process, but for now nobody wants to do this. And today Zelensky reported that the next year he is going to visit Crimea, so that means that he is planning to continue this bloody war. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.